photography can be a bit overwhelming to get into. You've got to learn about all these different cameras. You've got to learn settings, composition, and exposure. And if you shoot Fujifilm, you got to learn and understand film simulations. Film simulations are the bread and butter of Fujifilm cameras. They're part of what make them unique and fun to use. The most obvious way to familiarize yourself is to go out and shoot with each one and see which ones you like. But I'll save you some time and share with you the many different things I've learned about film simulations over the years. We'll cover everything that exists up to the X106, the latest being Reala Ace at the time of writing. And of course, I'll show a bunch of photos. Some of these will be edited, some of these will be straight out of camera. This will also be a descriptive comparison, not scientific, based on my experience, so it won't be 100% accurate. Let's begin. Classic Chrome. Since its release, Classic Chrome has become one of the most popular film simulations. Being loosely based off of Kodachrome, Classic Chrome is very versatile. You can use it in basically any setting from street, travel, and everyday photography. It's characterized by a slightly muted look. This is because colors aren't as strong in Classic Chrome and they tend to sway to the colder side. Blues are more teal blue, while browns tend to sway pink rather than yellow, making skin tones sometimes nice, sometimes hard to work with. Contrast tends to be fairly even since the shadows are good, which helps give it that chrome look. Because of its more muted look, Classic Chrome tends to act as a great base for editing photos. There's a lot of room to push and pull, especially if you have a higher dynamic range setting. And because color saturation and color pop isn't nearly as pronounced as some other film simulations, it prevents a lot of people from cooking their photos, especially when the temptations nowadays is to add more color. Classic Chrome also acts as a great base for many custom film simulations. When emulating film, many people will use Classic Chrome as the primary film simulation in their film simulation recipes and tweak a bunch of settings here and there to create different looks. It does a great job at replicating different film stocks, and there's a lot of room to push and pull contrast, shadows, and colors, just like photo editing. Some of my most used custom film simulations that have Classic Chrome are Portrait 400 and Usual, a personalized one I made not to look amazing straight out of camera, but rather to see things clearer. So Classic Chrome is probably the film simulation I use the most, maybe 80 to 90% of my photos are edited off it. But it has been pretty popular these past few years, so some people might be getting tired of the aesthetic. Because of this, I've been using other film simulations or trying different looks just to mix it up a bit. But I'd still recommend Classic Chrome since it's one of the best film simulations. Let's move on. Classic Negative. Classic Negative is probably my second most used color film simulation. I like it because it provides a stark contrast or difference from Classic Chrome. While Classic Chrome acts as a flat base for a lot of edits, Classic Negative has much more character in comparison. Typically when I think of Classic Negative, I think of a shift in browns, a sway in greens, and a strong contrast. You can see some of the characteristics of Classic Negative in these shots I took of the Hachimangu Shrine. The shifting green makes the green look more green-green as opposed to yellow-green. I prefer this look and have even taken and applied this hue shift to many of my other edits that aren't in Classic Negative. You may also notice the reds as well have a less bright and deeper hue to them. Sometimes I feel as if Classic Negative sways the reds to the brown side and the browns become less yellow per se. Furthermore, the overall tonality of the images is high, with brighter highlights and darker shadows. This contrast can help give your shots a bit more pop when your photos are looking dull. Now, I'd exercise a bit of caution when using Classic Negative. It's great and fun because of its unique aesthetic, but it doesn't work for every situation. And oftentimes, I'll find it a bit too strong for some shots. So I'll mainly use it when a more standard film simulation is a bit boring, or if I can take advantage of the look it has. Acros. Out of the two black and white film simulations Fujifilm has, Acros is probably my most used one. It's based on Fuji's own Acros film stock from back in the day, which seemed to be quite popular. Now, it depends how you use it, but my general impressions of Acros is a more dramatic, higher contrast, moody, and grainy aesthetic. This is in part because the custom settings and tone curves I use in camera emphasize these aspects, but I still find this to be true when comparing a base Acros to monochrome. For a time period, I was obsessed with Kevin Mullen's newspaper recipe, which would blow out the highlights, darken the shadows to oblivion, and make everything look timeless. The slight shift to greens in the shadow were also a great touch. I made a video with this recipe way back, you can find it in the links here somewhere. Nowadays, I'll tend to edit my black and white shots with a bit more of a balanced exposure, but I'll still use the recipe if I feel like it. When shooting black and white on Fujifilm cameras, you also get the option to use a red, yellow, or green filter. These filters simply change the way light and color get interpreted in your camera. It's up to you whether you want to use them or not. Standard acros works just as well. In a sort of non-scientific interpretation, here are my impressions of each filter. Yellow is the most standard and will make your blues darker. This can add some contrast between your clouds, skies, and the rest of your photos. Red filters I generally use for skin tones when it's dark, as it'll lift the reds and brighten them, making them pop more. So I kind of use it as an exposure hack rather than a filter. Green filters I probably use the least, but it usually darkens the reds and oranges. If you're unsure of which filter to use, stick to the standard acros or acros with the yellow filter. That's probably the most versatile one. You can also check your RAWs in post on Lightroom or Capture One to compare them side by side and understand the difference. Moving on. Monochrome. Monochrome is another black and white film simulation available on Fujifilm cameras. This is what you'd consider your standard black and white that you'd get on many other cameras. When compared to acros, monochrome is generally flatter, more balanced, less moody, less heavy, and just solid all around. This can be a preferable look to acros as you might not always want the deeper tones or drama. Personally, I don't use monochrome that often unless I want to balance the exposure in my highlights or the drop in my shadows. But I have seen many instances where the lighter, softer look looks better. If you're just looking for a standard black and white to use, monochrome is great for that. It's got the same filters available to it that acros does, and it can be a much friendlier base for editing. I've been meaning to dive into it and go on a monochrome phase, but we'll see if I ever get to it. Sepia. Sepia is one of those dead looks that probably doesn't get enough love. It's one of those standard color profiles that many digital cameras have, so it's not an exclusive Fujifilm film simulation. Sepia is a reddish-brown sort of monochrome look that was popular in the early days of photography, and it was used as a way to improve the longevity of black and white photos. Its usefulness has sort of died out in the modern era because everything is digital and we don't really need that anymore. And in many cases, I'd rather just edit in black and white than in sepia. So it's one of those things that has gone out of style, popularity, and usefulness over time. The sepia look is often reminiscent of older times. When I look at photos in sepia, I think vintage, retro, 1800s. Because of this association, it's difficult to imagine the daily photos I take in a sepia profile. That's probably another big reason as to why I don't use it. It's not the most appealing aesthetic to me personally, but it can be a cool look. Maybe I'll take the dive one day. Pro Negative. Pro Negative High and Pro Negative Standard are like your hipsters, Classic Chrome. Back in the day when there were much less film simulations and Classic Chrome didn't exist, people used this. And every now and then I'll see someone say how Pro Negative is so much better. I'm personally not too experienced with the Pro Negative look since I've always just defaulted to Classic Chrome. But based on my limited understanding, Pro Negative seems to be very close in tones, only slightly more colorful and slightly more warm. The yellows, greens, and oranges aren't nearly as flat. Classic Chrome, however, tends to be more of a muted, colder, blue-gray feel. So Pro Negative doesn't get the same color shifts that Classic Chrome would. And just comparing them side by side, some of these shots I actually prefer the Pro Negative look. Sometimes Classic Chrome can be a bit too flat, while things like provia and astia can be a bit too much. So Pro Negative or Reala Ace can be a good in-between. I'll probably have to try it out more to understand it better. My recommendation is to flip-flop between the two and see which one you like. Now, the difference between the standard and high versions are mainly contrast. Standard is supposed to be more even and balanced, while high is higher. But when comparing them side by side to other film simulations, I actually prefer the high look. I think the contrast is closer to Classic Chrome, while the standard, although it says standard, tends to look more faded and be of lower contrast. However, standard can be useful in situations where you don't want things to be too moody, dramatic, or you just want room to add contrast yourself. So again, it is whichever one you prefer. Nostalgic Negative. Nostalgic Negative was the film simulation I was most excited getting about on the X100 VI. I'd heard about it when it was first added to the GFX series cameras, but I'd never gotten the chance to try it out. Nostalgic negative is a film simulation characterized by warmer highlights, softer tones, and an amber color cast. There's also a bit of a lift in the shadows when compared to other film simulations, so the contrast isn't too heavy. When shooting with this film simulation, I found myself enjoying it, although not nearly as much as I thought it would. It just wasn't what I expected when I first heard the name. I like the amber tint and the warmth of the shots, but it's not always the best look for the situation. The browns especially seem to get tinted to a more yellow-brown hue. This can work in some cases, but it isn't always up to my personal preferences. I found that nostalgic negative works best with a bit of natural sunlight, while colder days or indoor lighting aren't always as pleasing. But I do like the general look and aesthetic and would recommend trying it out. Eterna. Eterna is my most used film simulation for video. It's not a film simulation I use often for photography, rather its strengths lie elsewhere. This is because of its flat and muted appearance. I've described Classic Chrome as flat and muted earlier. You can think of Eterna as that times 2 without the color shift. Where Classic Chrome has deeper solid shadows, Eterna pulls them up. The highlights get dropped as well, and white balance is more white, neither blue nor orange. You can observe the difference as I pan over these film simulations. It almost looks as if someone pulled the contrast dial all the way down without removing the detail. You can argue that this makes a great base for editing photos, but I found that it can sometimes be a bit much. Where Eterna shines, in my opinion however, is for video. Its high flatness, low contrast, muted look mimics halfway between a log and standard color profile. This is great for beginners who want to color grade but aren't quite at that level of grading straight from log. Furthermore, video in Eterna is already decent without editing, so you can export it as is if you truly want. Skin tones also show up quite nicely, and all of the talking head videos you'll see me post are recorded in Eterna. Personally, I like to go a step further and toss a -2 reverse S-curve in camera. This gives me maybe 65% of a normal log look, which leaves a little more room to add contrast and shadow in post. And with the dynamic range on Fujifilm cameras, you're honestly not missing out on much. Eterna Bleach Bypass. While Eterna is like Classic Chrome times 2 in mutedness, Eterna Bleach Bypass is that on steroids. It's hard to describe, but it reminds me of a stripped down desaturated Classic Chrome or a higher contrast muted Eterna. You can even think of it as shooting in black and white with a little bit of color left. Its tones does remind me a bit of Classic Negative, as the shadows tend to be deeper and the brightness tends to be high. It's honestly a pretty cool film simulation, but I don't use it that much because if I'm gonna go that far, I might as well shoot in black and white. And because it has such a noticeable look, the situations you can use it in are few. I think it's useful if colors seem to be getting in the way and you want the tones without going full black and white, or if you just like the way it looks. Velvia. If you can imagine someone took all the saturation, the clarity, the contrast, turned all the dials up, bottled it all into a film simulation, that'd be Velvia. Velvia is probably the strangest film simulation out there. And for the longest time, I didn't understand it because it seemed like a cluster of things that shouldn't exist. Fujifilm describes it as their vivid film simulation. I think that's putting it lightly. When you use Velvia, everything goes crazy, and in most cases, it doesn't work. It's the epitome of cooking your photos just as a film simulation. In my honest opinion, many of the photos I've taken with it just look straight up ugly. That is, until I found the right circumstances for it. A couple years ago, I went on a binge of photographing sunsets. I took thousands of photos of the sun, light rays, cloud formations, you name it. And when editing, Classic Chrome and the other film simulations just didn't cut it. They didn't give the pop or saturation I felt like the images needed to look the way I wanted or the way I felt like they did at the time. Even when editing and turning up the saturation dials to the max, I couldn't quite get the right colors. That's when I switched to Velvia. For some reason, the colors, contrast, and clarity that made my other photos so ugly made these sunsets extremely vibrant and appealing. And the range and flexibility I had to push colors a certain way without overdoing it was awesome. Velvia also works quite well for abstract photos if you really want to smack the color there. So the important thing I learned here was Velvia looks best for unreal scenarios. Things that don't look real and aren't supposed to be real or accurate to actual life. I wouldn't recommend Velvia for basic stuff like portraits or people because the skin tones and color just won't look right. Instead, save it for photos that really need that punch and don't need to look real or color accurate, like sunsets. Provia. Provia is Fujifilm's standard color profile. It's the closest to what you'd get when shooting with a default color profile on another camera. Because of this, I've stayed away from it because it honestly felt generic to me. A big part of why I enjoy shooting Fujifilm is because I could shoot in different film simulations and tweak things to get different looks. So shooting in a standard color profile was of no interest to me. While many other film simulations have a look or character to them, Provia is almost neutral to all of these. If you could imagine taking a photo with an iPhone or smartphone, Provia is the closest thing to that standard look in my opinion. The greens are mostly yellow-green as opposed to classic negative's green-greens. The white balance is generally even as opposed to classic chrome and nostalgic negative. And colors tend to be more saturated than the other film simulations, which is why I generally don't like using it because it feels a bit fake to me. Now, it's not all bad. Provia can come in handy and many photographers seem to enjoy it. And although I tend to think of Provia as boring, you could argue that a better word for it is balanced. I think its strengths are when you're having trouble getting the right look from your other film simulations. When classic chrome isn't colorful enough, classic negative's colors don't look that good, and maybe you don't want that pop that Astia gives. Provia is reliable in these cases when other film simulations just aren't working, or if you just need something standard and non-characteristic. I'll have to see how it compares to Reala Ace editing-wise, since that could be a better alternative. But currently, they're much more similar than I thought. I just prefer Reala Ace for its colors and tones. Astia. Astia is Fujifilm's supposedly soft film simulation. This probably comes from the tones and contrast, as it's slightly flatter and more even than the others. Soft isn't the first thing I think of when I think of Astia, however. For me, the first thing that comes to mind is the pop. You can see in some of these shots how Astia changes the rendition of certain colors. Colors like blue and yellow in particular gain a lot of character with Astia. Blues become more blue-blue as opposed to classic chrome's slightly teal blue. This character is less noticeable but similar to the character you'd find in other film simulations. They affect the image in a way you can't edit out of, and is difficult to replicate separately. So if I'm going to edit an image in Astia, classic negative, or anything with noticeable characteristics, I'll try to keep that in mind. Because of this, I don't often use Astia, save for when I need that part of it. Now, that aside, Astia isn't actually that far off from Provia. Colors are similar, and although they do have a look to them, it's not as extreme as some of the others. The main difference is in tones, since Astia's got that soft look. Before Reala Ace came out, Astia was my alternative to Provia when I needed another standard color profile to edit off of. I don't usually prefer Astia as skin tones can be a bit too yellow and colors in general can be a bit much, but it does have its uses in certain scenarios when the other film simulations just aren't working. I'd recommend playing around with it. It can be hard to tell the differences at first, but you might end up really liking it. Reala Ace. Within the past 6 months or so, Reala Ace has been the film simulation that's grown on me the most. It was first introduced in one of the GFX series cameras back in 2023, but was also added to the X100VI upon release. I initially thought it would be another boring standard profile, much like Provia or Astia. There's nothing wrong with those film simulations, I still use them from time to time, but they're often not my taste. Ironically, I started experimenting with Reala Ace, initially just for fun, and I found myself really enjoying the look. The film simulation is based on the Fuji Superior Reala Ace 100 color negative film, which was only sold in Japan. Fujifilm describes it as faithful color reproduction with hard tonality, which at first makes no sense. You're basically just telling me good colors, good contrast, which is really nothing, but as I started to shoot with Reala Ace, it actually began to make more sense. The film simulation is literally that. The colors you'll get with Reala Ace is often true to the eye and true to tone. In my experience, I found that many of the other film simulations shift the color in some way or have some kind of characteristic to them. But Reala Ace has almost a non-preferential color base with good contrast, which is pretty much what Fujifilm described it as. Now, side by side, it's actually quite close to Provia. But unlike Provia, which can feel a bit too smartphony for my taste, Reala Ace is brighter in the midtones. I think this makes a big difference because I often raise the brightness in my tone curves anyways. I like the way it looks and the way it feels. And for some reason the color, although not too far off from Provia, doesn't turn me off in the same way. So Reala Ace seems to be a great alternative from the other standard color film simulations, especially if you don't want something with too much character. I'll have to use it more, but overall it's become a pleasant surprise that's moving its way up my top film simulations list. So I hope you found this useful. If you have a friend who's getting into Fujifilm and needs a breakdown of every film simulation, share this with them, it might help. If you're looking to build a solid foundation with photography, check out Photography Essentials. It's free. And be sure to check out The Sinking Sun, my latest photography zine. We also have new prints and limited merch available. Thanks as always for watching. Have a great day. Happy shooting. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.